All right, welcome to part one of understanding the 10 mark questions. So, just to backtrack a little bit before we begin, there is an introduction video that I've made explaining the video series, what it's for, how it can support students, and it kind of gives a breakdown as to what you can expect with each stage. So, if that's something you want to check out before, going into the video series themselves, then feel free to pause this, come back to it, whatever you want to do. It's not, you're not missing out on anything skills wise if you don't watch it, but it might be useful for you. But moving forward, I think the best place to start with this is just go straight into the learning aims. So, what are we expecting to achieve, or what can you expect to achieve by the end of this? So, we need to explore the different types of 10 mark questions. You will know from your studies so far that, for example, with culture and identity, you're going to have two types of 10 mark questions. And we really need to understand the differences, the visual differences, what the questions are asking you to do, etc. Then we need to look at the assessment objectives for the outline and explain questions. So those are the questions about the item. And that helps form how we're going to approach the question, what matters and what doesn't. And then finally, we need to briefly look at the differences between analysis and evaluation for the outline and explain 10 mark questions. Again, because I'll explain it later on, but there are no marks for evaluation in that question. Therefore, you need to understand that before you start writing. So, with all that being said, let's look at the question that we're going to focus on for the remainder of the video series. Now, I picked this question from a culture and identity paper. So you might have seen it, you might not have, but this is what we're going to be using. So let's get this here. Outline and explain 2 reasons why consumption may be affected by social class. Standard question, you could get something very similar to that in the exam, but that's what we're going to be using going forward. Now, if you want more support from these videos, I would suggest that you also use this question and create your own points as we go along, as we answer it together. If you want to try and push yourself, or you're feeling ready to do that, you might want to pick a different 10 mark non-item question. The main thing you need to do is make sure it's one of these outline and explain questions, or else a lot of the stuff that we cover isn't going to apply. So that's the only thing I would say about that. But this is the question we're going to be using. Now, we need to look at another type of 10 mark question, the one with the item, so you can clearly see the difference. So if we move up here, let's get rid of that. This question, so applying material from item A, analyze 2 ways that individuals may be socialized into identities based on age. Now, I'm not too worried about what the actual question is asking us to do this in the specifics, because we're not focused on that. All I want you to see is the differences between them. So the most obvious difference here, there are a few differences, but the most obvious one is going to be this bit of text, what we call a source or an item. This question has an item, this question does not. Now that's obvious, we can see that, but there might be a tendency in an exam to have all sorts of thoughts and panic and make a mistake. So what do I mean? Well, it's not uncommon for students to think that maybe there's meant to be an item there and it's not been printed. Maybe they think that this item relates to both questions because they're both 10 marks. All sorts of things can come up in a student's head, especially when the clock's ticking and they're under that pressure. So if you don't pick anything else from this video, please remember this, that the outline and explain questions do not have an item and are not supposed to have an item. That leads us to our next point. What the question is actually testing you on. So if they're both 10 marks, are they similar in what the testing is on? No. So this question here, so the outline and explain question, is testing us on our ability, depth of knowledge. So depth of knowledge. Hopefully you can read that. Depth of knowledge is what we're being testing on here. While this 10-mark question is testing us and our ability to apply to a source. Now, I don't want to go off track here, but the item is there to be used. It's not an optional thing for that particular question. Therefore, you need to be able to use the item and apply your knowledge, or show your knowledge and apply it to the source itself. So that's important for you to know in terms of the differences. These are the core differences. Now, there's a couple of things you have to consider with the outline and explain question. As a consequence of having no item, so no item, this means there are no hooks. Now, what does that mean? So with the 10-mark questions that do have an item, you can use the item to kind of choose points, talking points. So you might read a certain bit in an item and think, I can talk about that because I can apply it to this theory or this concept I have. It provides a little bit of guidance. Whereas with this question, the only guidance you've got is what's in your head. So if you don't have the knowledge, there's nothing you can read that can prompt you to consider a different point. So there's less guidance. So if there's less guidance, it can make these 10 markers feel a bit more, I guess, challenging, less support, more daunting when you go in there and all you see is a question with no item there for you to read. So that's an important thing to consider as well, that this question can sometimes cause students more trouble because they don't know where to start. Hence why we're making these videos to help with your skills in order to answer the questions. And then finally, there's one thing I do want to mention. I don't know if now is a good time to mention it, but I will. There are no marks for evaluation. Your job here is not to say your opinion or to say, I think this is better than this, or you're not passing judgment on this. This question is about really going in depth with your understanding, applying those concepts, those theories, your wider reading, and what this means, and linking it back to the question. So those are the main differences that you need to be aware of. The next thing we need to do is we need to talk about the assessment objectives. So you can see here, you've most likely seen these before, and they kind of inform where your marks are going to come from for each question. So you have AO1, knowledge and understanding. So you're talking about your names, your theories, your concepts, your dates, the little details, the statistics, those sorts of things. Applying knowledge, so selective points and bringing in wider reading. Can you think of any real-world examples of a particular point that you've brought up or talked about? Have you chosen the best points that apply to the question? These sorts of things. And then analysis and evaluation. As we know, there is no evaluation. Oh, I want to put this in red. So there is no evaluation for this. It's analysis. So really going in as much as you can, going right to the bottom of the point you're trying to make, not just scratching the surface of it. You're really applying it. The next thing we need to look at is the mark distribution for this type of question. So how many marks in total? Well, we have 10. AO1, 5 marks. So that tells you that you're going to get a lot of marks for your knowledge and understanding. Again, that highlights this point. Where have I put it? It's testing depth of knowledge. It really highlights that. How much do we know? And then AO2, 3 marks, so a little bit less, but you're applying that knowledge. So again, did you pick the most appropriate points? Are you bringing in your wider reading? How are you showing that? And then finally, analysis, 2 marks. The interesting thing here is, since you can very easily get up to those 5 marks if you just showed your knowledge, but the higher marks are going to be capped about your application and selective application. And the fact that you don't have that source or that item there is really going to test that. Okay, one last point to make before we wrap up here. Analysis versus evaluation. So I guess a really good way to try and visualize it in your head is, analysis is about exploring those points in depth, not just making a statement and then moving on. What does it mean? And what does that mean? Etc., etc. Not just leaving things, not discussed fully. Versus making judgments or weighing points with evaluation. You're not trying to weigh up the points, the pros and cons with things for this question. You're trying to show your knowledge and your depth of understanding. No marks for evaluation. Again, I can't stress that enough. And we have one final thing here, which is the cool versus cool paragraphs. So we will talk more about that in a future video, but we essentially are going to be using this structure going forward for this type of question, because there's no evaluation, meaning that there's no point in trying the usual strategy of writing a knowledge, understanding, link evaluation. We need knowledge, understanding, more understanding, and then link. Okay? So I know I've just talked your ears off for I don't know how long, and there might be a lot of questions you have about this. Any questions that you do have, please contact me. You have Teams, Outlook, whatever you want to do, and we can discuss it. These videos are here to support you, and it's very useful for you to try that independence first. But if you do need that guidance from me that goes beyond these videos, please do reach out. So going forward, the task that I need you to do for the next video is you need to choose a 10-mark non-item question. You can use the one that we've just looked at for this video. You can use a completely different one as long as it fits the outline and explain type of question. Whatever you want to do, it's completely up to you. Okay, the videos will still apply no matter what. So we'll leave it there. Again, if you've got any points you want to ask me, or any feedback, or whatever you want to share with me, it's always going to be appreciated. Okay, so I'll see you next time, and take care.